Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you also, Madam Motlanthe, for all your kind words and your hospitality. I don't want to make a secret out of it because it's impossible with this sort of transparent podium, but as everybody spoke, I had to completely rewrite what I was going to do. The subject that Mrs. Motlanthe brought out is we've got shifting issues. It's been, in fact, today very hard to try and pinpoint in this Gordian knot that we find ourselves in all developing countries, which is the one little knot that composes the big Gordian knot that we must untie if the whole knot is to be dealt with. We mentioned the issue corruption, migration, poverty, inequality, unemployment. I could have been in Latin America. I could have been in the Middle East. I could have been in Asia. And we've got that problem. It's even in some degree also a European problem, as Mr. Piketty of France points out, inequality, and he mentions all those aspects. And that is because essentially what has happened, that is the most outstanding and revealing issue, is that if you start from the Second World War, but especially since the collapse of economic communism, first of all gradually in China, I think it was 1979 with Deng Xiaoping, as the Chinese declared, I don't care what color the cat has as long as it catches mice. And then 1989, the collapse in the Soviet Union, it fell apart, and the collapse of economic communism throughout Eastern Europe. During that time until today, the Western countries, call it Europe, call it North America, and the westernized part of all societies in developing countries, where there's a little bit of Switzerland and a lot of Nigeria, have actually grown twice as much as they grew between the time of Jesus Christ and the beginning of the Second World War. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, what did they do that somehow or other we didn't do, and we have left behind, as President Motlanthe said, a lot of people? And how do we get them to catch up? Why doesn't the message come across? After all, we have Europe to look at. We have North America to look at. And these economies started pretty much like we did. The British started with the enclosures. The French Revolution started with the idea of catching up and giving not only the bourgeoisie, but all of the social classes some kind of an issue, some kind of a participation in property rights and water rights. The whole idea of migration towards the West in the United States was, how do we get France and Spain and Mexico out of the territory so we can actually create a thriving economy based on Jefferson's vision of property rights. They started there. And the problem that we have in looking towards the North, for example, is that when you ask these people who have succeeded, how did they make it? They have no idea. They have no idea. They just got there. They'll come up and tell you, you got to eat a lot of meat. They'll come up and tell you, you got to be Protestant. They'll tell you, no, what you really have to do is there's something in our culture you must understand. It's the common law. Well, if it's the common law, how did the Germans get there? They've got Roman law. How does this all work out? No, the Swiss will tell you. The secret is 7 presidents at the same time. And if you actually go and tell the Americans, no, we don't allow the populists to get into power. It's the electoral colleges where you win elections, not the people's vote. Oh. Then you tell the Japanese, how did you get there? And they say it's not only vertical government, it's the way we actually organize government. So if you look at them all, they've got all different experiences. And they all started in different places. So the question is, what is the Gordian knot that explains all these other things? Now, I received a challenge when my new friend, Roger McGay, was here, and he said, I challenge Dr. Soto. How do we identify the receivers, the beneficiaries, Roger, of all these, of our settlers in the mountain? That would even be a challenge for De Soto. So the first thing I will do, as the inheritor of Spain and matadors and great conquistadors, is say, it's a cinch, Roger. It's not a problem. I can identify them even if I'm not a South African. So I immediately asked my fiance, who went down there, to put a photograph. This is me in Peru. And I could show you photographs of me in other countries. And what I did was, when somebody challenged me the last time, how are you going to find in this informal economy made up of communes, kings, feudal systems, local economies that the central government does not control, who will want to be put under the rule of law and receive title? And I just sent a missive ahead because I was invited by a local government, and that's me in the center, and I got 10,000 people, and in 3 months I had identified everybody. And I've done that in Egypt, and I've done that everywhere. Why? Because I said, you already have the land. You actually made a claim on the past, and they'd give it back to you. Or you had an agrarian reform, and in the agrarian reform, you redistribute it. Or you had decolonization, and those who fought for freedom, like President Motlanthe, went out and started recording who people were and what they were doing, because it was with their power that they came into power. So the records are there, and the question is, they already have the dirt. We don't have to give them the dirt, they already got it. By force, by powers of centrifugal, whatever it is, they got the court. What I said there is, I'm not going to go around in the name of the programs that we had in about 30 countries now, and we're succeeding in about 7, saying you have the right to land. I said, you got the right to land, which gets you capital. Because anybody's got capital. I mean, anybody's got land. I mean, land produces potatoes, it produces a lot of interesting things. But land, essentially, if you're identified, located, and if you make sure at the same time that there's trust that's involved and you have something to lose, begets capital. And what you have to tell them is that the difference between the people who can make wealth in a society, in developing countries, maybe 10, 30%, depending on where you go, whether it's Mexico, whether it's Peru, whether it's Egypt. Egypt has an informal sector of 92%. Those are the ones that are able to prove where they are, who they are, and become accountable, and get all the certifications that are necessary all the way into financial markets. They've created a long, long value chain between what you can hold physically and what you can hold in abstract, what you can hold physically and what you can hold metaphysically, because it's a rather complex problem. I mean, even Karl Marx said so when he was asked, where does the word capital come from? Why do you like it? And he said, because capital comes from the Latin word capita, which is your head, and you can only understand the creation of wealth if you capture it in your head. It's abstract, and it isn't money. It can be converted into money. It can be converted into a boat, into a car, into a house, and that is capital, because it becomes capital when you sell it. So the real question then is the following. How is it that some people, after independence of Latin American countries, from Spain, from Portugal, how is it that independence of African countries, and most of the world, decolonization, and after the whole world decides to drop economic communism and go down some form of a market economy, the fascinating model that the Chinese have, for example, or the Swedish model is not at all like the Swiss model. But the idea there is competition and accumulation of capital. And the reply to all that is, and to answer the question, I mean, a first glimpse at the question of my friend President Motlanthe is, why did these people get left behind? I'll tell you why. It's because the westernized parts of our society basically were organized around Western law, which means that a lot of what they have, the papers and the value chain that they can access, is intimately connected all the way into financial markets. While the rest of the country are people who are the result of many governments coming into place. They're new. They haven't been in government yet. They have budgetary shortages. And one way or another on the way said, let's leave these locals with the power to organize themselves locally. I mean, you've got so many enemies when you finally get your freedom that you simply delegate away. You've got agrarian reforms that are started ambitiously throughout Latin America. And then halfway along the way, you find out what Roger McKay said, which is, we don't know where the settlers are. Who am I going to receive it? Give it to local government. So you gave them to local government. You had border wars. You win a border war, you got to immediately settle the area before the enemy comes back in. So you empower the locals and you give them the record keeping. So you've got your registries, locally. You've got feudal lords who say, I want some of it because I helped you win, and you give the feudal lord the right to award property. And doing all of that, what you have actually done is we have awarded sovereignty, not property rights, sovereignty to the locals. Now, one thing is awarding them the right to divide land, but another thing is sovereignty. What is sovereignty as opposed to property rights? Sovereignty is the right of a government that is elected or that is in power, in all cases, to decide who gets what. So the moment that you actually give too much of it to the locals, I'm trying to also be interesting and controversial, you have given away the right to form the rule of law to people who will divide your country up. Because the advantage that you have in any country in Europe, whether it's called a confederate state, a federal state, or whatever it is, the rights that you have under the one rule of law are uniform. They might, in one case, say you have to protect the lagoon. In another case, they'll say this. But in all cases, they say everybody has the same right. And we in developing countries have not given everybody the same right. Now, the best way I can think of illustrating this, because it becomes really hypothetical, and I want it to be as real as possible, is mining and petroleum and energy, which I know is of concern to you like it is to us. And I want to illustrate it because I think it will reveal not only the issues, the shifting issues that Madame Motlanthe said characterized this meeting. It is that it will also bring to light how this will not only a local problem, but will be a universal problem. It's on its way. If you don't believe me, think, for example, at this moment of the rivalry between the United States and China. Well, it looks like a border tax adjustment war. It looks like a tariff war. It looks like a trade war, but it's really more than that. It has to do with the fact that all of a sudden, after talking so much about that wonderful thing called information technology, all of a sudden we see the Chinese, I mean in my country, and welcome to the Chinese, actually developing most of the mines in Peru. And good, because they come with an attitude that is most interesting, as one of them told me. I'm, by the way, a member of the Economist Hall of Fame in China and of information technology, and I lead one of the biggest blockchain groups in that country. Well, I advise on it. But what they're doing is they're getting into natural resources everywhere, which means that land is important to them. And I think President Trump all of a sudden starts realizing this when he says, hey, I want to buy Greenland. So You got information technology, but somehow or other, we of the third world are also pretty important. So the question there comes to be the following one. What is it that a title that is created out of Western law give you that a title that is created locally, empowered and governed locally, but unplugged to the global system does not give you? One, it cannot be used as a guarantee to receive credit. Now, try and find a country that's developed without credit. Because credibility comes from Latin, which means I find you credible and I trust you. It means that there's a series of documents, one after the other: location, identity, who's the local authority that can enforce, who are you, have you got the property, have you got advanced gender rights, do you share it with your wife or don't you share it with your wife? It's really very important. And all these pieces of information come at a point that they can be enforceable against credit. But it also means that you can pledge it against investment. So the problem that we now have in the world, for example, is that there are at this moment $150 trillion. Listen to me, because it isn't really published yet. You'll see a couple of speeches here.
All right, we've been hearing